You do me honor by inviting me. You do me honor by coming here. But I'm not sure I'm deserving of this great honor. Vijay referred to me as a guru, management guru. And let me quickly disabuse you that my idea of such a guru is somebody who is good at understanding, GU, but relatively useless, RU. Of course, the word guru is also in my name, which presents a problem. But it wasn't always so. Until the age of 3, believe it or not, my name was Ashok Kumar. But my grandmother suspected that my mother had given me that name because she thought my mother was secretly in love with the Bollywood actor, Ashok Kumar. And so she took me to her guru and placed me at his feet. And she said to the guru, "Enu na dyoji." And so the guru looked down at me with a smile, and I looked up at him with a smile. And he said, "Let's call him Gurcharan Das." Now, you know, in India, we take our names seriously. Unlike, you know, in the West where everybody's Tom, Dick or Harry. And I think the guru was sending me a message also. I must say that in my long experience in business, I've met many leaders. But the best leaders I've met are those who had two qualities. One was determination, fierce willpower. And the second was not intelligence, which is an overrated virtue, but actually humility. Now, humility doesn't mean they were not ambitious. Fiercely ambitious they are. But their ambition is for their work, for their companies. We have had a prime minister that we've admired now for some years, who has shown a lot of humility. And now we would like him to show a little bit more determination. Now, speaking to the students this morning, I want to ask you whether you know the difference between making a living and making a life. What is this difference? This is what I would like to talk about. Making a living versus making a life. Making a living is something that our middle class insecurities ensure that we do. We go to the university like NIIT and we get an engineering degree, or we'll get an MBA, or we'll get later medicine or law. And all these professions prepare us to make a living. And then we enter into these professions, we get married, we have children, we look after the children, we rise in our jobs, we get promoted, we climb ladders, and we earn more, we get our children married, they begin the same process. And then we ask ourselves, or should ask ourselves, is this all there is to it? What was it all about? And this is where, now that you are in the university, you should ask, should I not be making a life? Because that's what a university is really for. And that's what I hope, Vijay and Rajiv, you will think about, aspire to, with this wonderful place, NIIT. that you want the student to make a life. Now, what does it mean to make a life? Make a life begins with giving yourself a test, a thought game. Let's play a thought game. What if I have only 3 months to live? What will I do in those 3 months? Would I live differently from the way I live today? And so, in fact, you ask yourself, how do I live a flourishing life? And you ask yourself, what is the purpose of life? If you have thought about this, you may remember that in the classical Hindu tradition at least, the notion of the life having multiple purposes, kama, artha, dharma, moksha, like Aristotle suggested, that life had multiple, there was a plural purposes of managing desire, achieving material well-being, achieving moral well-being, and achieving spiritual well-being. So how does one go about making a life? Well, you can depend on your own experience, which means you can try to reinvent the wheel with your own experience. But millions of people have gone and come and gone in life, and we can learn from them. Many of them have left behind books to read. So, a purposive life, a life which you make, begins from learning from others. And these few thousand human beings left behind what somebody called the great books. Now, if you go back home and Google great books, you'll find about 125 titles of the great books. And there are universities in America who are dedicated to teaching and giving an education based purely on the great books. The idea was first thought through in places like Chicago, Columbia, 100 years ago. And then they created for their undergraduates a great books program, a sort of, it's often called a core curriculum. That in the first, that's right, Hutchinson, that in the first 2 years of your college, you will only read the great books. Now these are great books like Plato, Marx, Freud, T.S. Eliot, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, you know. But it doesn't contain, it's not there right now, but this great books program will also include, especially if you're an Indian, the Mahabharat, the Manava Dharma Shastra, the Katha Upanishad, the Kama Sutra, and so on. So now, since we don't have this in our universities, this idea, what are you going to do? Well, to begin with, you have a summer vacation. So why not think about starting your own great books learning program during the summer. Get your friends involved in a book club and read these books and meet in the evening and discuss these books. And when you read these books, you interrogate the text. You're not going to mug it up for an exam. And discuss the next day with your friends. Why should I believe in God? Why should I believe in rebirth? Anyway, you get my point. So, go back, Google great books, make your own little list and get started. And if you have a little more time and interest, read a book, an unusual book by a man called David Denby, who is the film critic of the New York magazine, who at mid-career, in his 50s, went back to Columbia University to read the great books as a part of the core curriculum program. So, Google him, David Denby, great books, and he has written a very inspiring account of how one educates oneself in the humanities. Let me just quickly narrate one example, my example, and I do so not in order to look good before you, but to narrate one person's experience. And honestly, one person's experience honestly captured is really the only true data of history that we have. So, I was lucky. At the age of 16, I won a scholarship and I went to a university, to Harvard, when it was fashionable to go to England, to go to Oxbridge. I was the diligent son of a diligent engineer who worked for the government, and I began to study engineering until somebody told me that you don't come to Harvard to study engineering, you go to MIT up the river, down the river. And so I shifted in my first semester from engineering to chemistry. Why chemistry? Because the newspapers were full of the news at that time that a man called James Watson had just won the Nobel Prize along with a man called Crick, for having discovered the shape of the DNA molecule, the double helix. At the end of my first summer, I came back to India. And that's when I first saw the grinding poverty of India. Now we don't see it. Only when we go away and come back do we actually see poverty. So, hoping for answers, I switched to economics in my second year. But in another few months, I was enticed by the offering of humanities in college. And so I switched. I switched again, and I took courses in Greek tragedy, Islamic history, Russian novel, Sanskrit love poetry, all this in college. I mean, I wanted to study everything, and the catalog was 200 pages long. So how did one study everything? By now, my parents in India, middle-class parents living in Chandigarh, had begun to despair because my mother's neighbor would ask her, "Toda munda ki pad raha hai?" And poor thing, my mother didn't know what to reply because every 6 months I had changed my major. So after a while she told me she stopped telling her neighbor what I was studying. And I also discovered a great man called Ingalls, Daniel Ingalls, with whom I studied Sanskrit. And this was the last straw for my mother. equally, I was attracted to the beautiful designs of Bauhaus architecture. And so I almost thought architecture would be a beautiful Mies van der Rohe, Corbusier, and wonderful lines that were part of the modernist experiment. Anyway, finally, in my third year, I was attracted to philosophy. So by then, even Harvard had lost patience, and it said, you have to now find a major. So my major became philosophy, and so I studied with John Rawls and wrote my thesis on the theory of justice. Now, I was going to go on to do philosophy, a PhD in philosophy, very normal kind of progression, you would say, and Isaiah Berlin was going to be my tutor, so it was all going in the right direction, until a few weeks before I had to go to do a postgraduate's work. This was in the summer, and I was back in Chandigarh, and sitting there, I said, do I want to spend the rest of my life in that high stratosphere of abstract thought? And so I got cold feet, and I decided not to go. And my parents began to despair that they had an unemployed son. And so to assuage them, I answered an advertisement by a company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. And I joined that company and became a salesman for Vicks Vapor Rub. So that is how I began in business, quite by accident. But like the man who came to dinner, I stayed on till the age of 50 in the business world, working in 6 countries, and with an enjoyable career, when I decided at 50 to take early retirement, to become a full-time writer. Now, I would say that in between I did go to Harvard Business School when the company discovered that I should learn something about doing business. But I must tell you, and a lot of you are going to go and do an MBA, that the background I had was not a hindrance but a help. What an undergraduate education in humanities had taught me was to think, to not accept anything at face value, not even if it was written by Plato. I was taught to interrogate a text. And so this stayed with me, and the ability to think clearly, to write clearly, even today, I must say, has been part of the reason why on a Sunday in 800 words, I'm able to discuss an issue, and whether it's an economic issue, a political issue, a social issue, and this and that. So this is really what is the difference between making a life and making a living. And I don't think I could have written a book like The Difficulty of Being Good, or not even India Unbound, if I did not have this very fortunate background. Now, prosperity is spreading in India, and it will continue to spread. We have now entered into another golden age of growth, And our per capita income, which is now about $1,000, will go up to $5,000 to $7,000. But happiness is not going to spread, and we are not going to go beyond a middle income country of $5,000 to $7,000, meaning we'll reach the Latin American stage of income, unless we fix governance. Governance, when I talk about governance, I'm not talking about a minister who's caught with a bribe, which we read about in everyday papers. I'm talking about how governance affects us all every single day. I'm thinking about the chutti bai in my house who went to get a birth certificate the other day and was asked for a bribe. I'm thinking about the fact that I have to get my driver's license renewed and I'm already worried, will I have to give a bribe? I'm thinking about 1 out of 4 school teachers in a government primary school who's absent and 1 out of 4 who's present but not teaching. And there are 3.7 million government primary school teachers in India who today earn 22,000 rupees a month starting salary after the 6th Pay Commission award. This starting salary is 7 times India's per capita income. The norm around the world is 1 to 2 times per capita income for a primary school teacher. Governance failure has 2 dimensions. It has an economic dimension or an institutional dimension, which is that if you were to sack one school teacher, all the rest would show up the next day. But it also has a moral dimension, which is that would they teach with inspiration and say that my dharma is my teaching, and I have to inspire the next generation. So this is what drove me to the Mahabharat. Now that's a pretty bizarre decision because you don't associate Mahabharat with dharma. But in fact, the Mahabharat is a text about dharma. It's obsessed with dharma. Mahabharat is also unique in engaging with the world of politics. And no one in the Mahabharat says, let's ask God for what is dharma. You have to figure it out yourself along with the characters. And finally, the Mahabharat, the dharma in the Mahabharat is a pragmatic idea. It does not seek moral perfection, and therefore it's uniquely suited for policy makers of today. So let me just illustrate. I have time. Okay, yes. Let me illustrate my strategy. How do I go about linking governance failures of today with the issue of dharma, with the Mahabharat, in order to create a coherent universe for ourselves? All human beings need that coherence when they wake up in the morning. Most of you know the story of the Mahabharat. It is a tale of rivalry between 2 sets of cousins, 2 sons of 2 brothers, descended from the Bharata family. And to contain that rivalry for the throne, the kingdom is divided. The worst half goes to the good guys, the Pandavas, and the better half, with the capital Hastinapur, goes to the good guys, to the bad guys, Kauravas. However, the good guys are diligent, hardworking. They have Arjuna on their side, the greatest warrior of his time. They clear their territories, they build a beautiful capital, they expand their territories. When with good diplomatic skills, they make alliances, and suddenly they've become the most important kingdom on the earth. And that's when Yudhishthira is told you can hold a ceremony of Rajasuya declaring you emperor. At this ceremony, kings, nobles bring huge amount of tribute to their emperor. Also invited is the eldest brother of the Kauravas, Duryodhan. And when he sees his cousins, the wealth and power, he grows envious. Accompanying Duryodhan is his uncle, Shakuni. And Shakuni sees his Duryodhan and he says, "My lord, you grow pale and sick." And Duryodhan, listen to what Duryodhan says. And this is an exact quote from the Mahabharat. He says, "What man of mettle will stand to see his neighbor prosper and himself decline?" Now, in that sentence, he has captured the terrible nature of envy. Just because my neighbor, my friend has done well, that I should feel bad, diminished. And yet, all of us suffer from this universal sickness. You will sympathize with jealousy. Jealousy is my fear that my friend may run away with my wife, and you'll be sympathetic to me. But you will not sympathize with envy. And it begins very early. I remember at the age of 5, there was another boy in our neighborhood when I was growing up. He had a red toy engine. And I hated him for it. And one day when he was not looking, I broke it. They did a study at Harvard with the class of 1987, and they asked, would you rather earn $100,000 a year or $50,000 a year? Everybody said 100,000. But then they put a condition and asked, at $100,000, if you earn that, your friends would be earning 200,000. But if you earn 50,000, your friends would be earning 25. Do you know that 83% of the people changed their answer? When I was working in Bombay, our factory was next to the factory of Philips, the Dutch lighting electronics company. And the union leader, the Philips factory had been on a strike for a whole year. So we were very worried. This is during Datta Samant's time. And one day I heard that the union leader said to his workers, I don't care if we ever open this factory again, as long as the Dutch factory manager goes down. This is when I understood why they say that if the sin of capitalism is greed, the sin of socialism is envy. And we have seen a celebrated battle between two brothers in India's most famous business family in recent years. People called it greed. But I said no. It is Anil Ambani's envy for his older brother. He wants the world to believe that he's as good as his older brother. I did not understand why decent, middle-class, God-fearing Germans in the 1930s were swayed by Hitler to do the most awful things to the Jews, until I read that more than 50% of the professionals of Berlin and Vienna were Jews. 64% of the physicians of Berlin were Jews, when Jews accounted for less than 5% of the population. So that country was seething with envy. Just as the Soviet Union, the sin of socialism is envy, Soviet Union was seething with envy. I don't know if there's a novel which was written in 1926, which describes how everybody lived in the same apartment. They had achieved a sense of equality. Wore the same clothes, had used the same transport. And then one day, one woman got a beautiful tablecloth. Her neighbors practically killed her. And she had to escape to save herself. Anyway, let's come back to the Mahabharat. So Shakuni says, look, these chaps have become too powerful. We can't take them on in a straight contest. We will have to use strategy. What does he mean by that? He says, look, I'm the greatest dice player in the world. Yudhishthir is the worst. But he's addicted to gambling. Moreover, you cannot lose because I also cheat, but nobody knows how. And so you all know there's the great gambling match in which Yudhishthir loses everything, including himself and his wife. And the Kauravas, in order to humiliate the Pandavas, drag in the queen, and at that moment they call her Dasi and smile and say, now we can do anything. She's our slave. But Draupadi is no weeping queen. She asks, who did my husband lose first? Himself or me? And the Kauravas immediately realize the trap, because he had lost himself first, which means by law he was not competent to stake her because he did not possess anything. Anyway, the Kauravas are not going to they're not going to wait for these delicacies. They say, strip her, and then you know the famous scene. Dushasan gets up and starts pulling her sari, and the sari begins to extend infinitely. And half an hour later, humiliated, he sits down. In half the manuscripts of the Mahabharat that the Bhandarkar Oriental Institute was working on to prepare the critical edition, you have the intervention of Krishna at this point. But in half the manuscripts you don't. So people asked the editors, their question was, now which scene should we keep in the critical edition? And they decided to keep the scene without Krishna. So the critical edition does not have Krishna. And so they asked, well, how did the miracle take place? And the answer, of course, is Dharma. Dharma also means cosmic justice. That it was her own character which was responsible for this miracle. When this TV series was being held and this scene was being played in that 104-week series, a Gujarati company in Bombay decided to market a Draupadi collection of saris. But they were not successful because I suppose the saris did not extend infinitely. At this point, Draupadi gets very angry. And she looks at all of them, especially at Bhishma. And she says, tell me, what is the dharma of the king? The subtext being, how did you let this happen? And then she quotes Rishi Kashyapa, who says that when a crime is committed, half the punishment goes to the person who commits the crime, a quarter of the punishment goes to the ally, and a quarter of the punishment goes And she looks at Bhishma, to those who remain silent. But they still remain silent. At this point in time, when I was working on this chapter in my book, the election to the President of India was taking place. And the UPA government had nominated a lady. We were delighted that we were going to have a woman president. But a few weeks before, we read disturbing reports about the background of this person. We heard there had been a murder in Maharashtra where her husband had been implicated. There was a bank owned by the family, and the bank had gone bust. The bank had gone bust, and the liquidator, the Indian Express reproduced a letter from the liquidator of the bank, who was an official of the Reserve Bank of India, who wrote the reason the bank went bankrupt was because members of her family had taken huge loans with no intention of paying them back. So I wrote a Sunday column in my time, in the Times at that time, and I said, it was an open letter to our Prime Minister. It was titled, "Don't Be Silent." I recounted the Draupadi story and the Rishi Kashyap's invocation that 1/4 of the punishment will go to the guilty, to the person who remains silent. A week later we had the election, and of course nothing happened. We had a new president who replaced the most popular president in Indian history, Abdul Kalam. But many of us felt diminished that day as Indians. But it is a tribute to the media, a media that we constantly criticize, that nobody ever mentioned the background of the president again out of respect for the office of the president. Anyway, so how are we doing? Oh yes, a few minutes more. I could go on, you know. Let me quickly. Now the Pandavas are in the forest. And Draupadi looks at her husband and she says, "My heart weeps for you. You who always slept on sheets of silk." This is in the jungle. He's sleeping on the hard earth. And she says, "My heart weeps for you. You who always slept on sheets of silk and pillows of down." They had goose down pillows. And she says, is this what the world is? That the good people must suffer in the jungle while the bad people live in what? Sundarnagar, golf links, Chanakyapuri. And so she says, look, you are a Kshatriya, your dharma is to wage a just war, so let's collect an army and go and win back our kingdom. And a dharma of a Kshatriya is to wage a just war, and our kingdom was stolen from us in a rigged game of dice. He says, no, my dharma is that I have given my word to Dhritarashtra that we will go in exile for 13 years. So Draupadi gets very confused. What is he talking about? Are there two meanings of dharma here? And you can see the Mahabharat has transposed two different meanings of dharma. A social meaning, you are a Kshatriya, Kshatriya dharma, versus a very personal virtue that he's talking about. I have given my word. The next day Vidura comes. Vidurniti, you all know, And they ask him, now Vidura is a royal counselor, and they say, you tell us what is dharma, because we are arguing amongst ourselves. And Vidura says, well look, my idea of dharma is that if it helps the people, it's dharma. If it harms them, it's adharma. So he's looking at he says, I look at the consequences of the deed, the results. But she says my husband is looking not at the consequences, some kind of inner motivation. So there is an interesting debate about what is dharma. And at this point, there was a child who was drowning off the beach in Goa. And the Times of India reported it about the fact that a young man from Hindu college jumped into the sea and saved this boy. The reporter of the Times of India said to him, look, you're a hero. Why did you do it? And he sheepishly says, we are a college party, we've come for a holiday to Goa, and frankly, I was trying to impress a girl in our party. And she says, but then you're not a hero. But Vidura would have said the child was saved. Yudhishthira, of course, would have jumped in if nobody was looking. So this is how, I'm giving you a modern example of how the Mahabharat has a very sophisticated approach to dharma, to understanding right and wrong. And it's full of very sophisticated, those of you who may have studied philosophy, can already see the differences between the consequentialists, the deontologists, etc. Anyway, that's not the point. I think I have lingered enough, but I can't close without talking about our favorite character in the Mahabharat, everybody's favorite character, Karna. There's a Muslim tribe in Gujarat who goes from village to village singing the song of Karna. For them, the hero of the Mahabharat is Karna. And I often wonder why he's such a tragic figure, why mothers in India give this name to their children, because he's so tragic. You can understand why every fifth Indian is called Arjun, because he's a success. He's a CEO material. But nobody calls their child Yudhishthira. I haven't found one. Maybe there is one. Karna's story we all know. He was born illegitimate. He's the eldest son of Kunti, so he is the eldest Pandava. But she's horrified when she has him illegitimately. So she floats him down the river. And down the river he's picked up by a charioteer. And so Karna grows up as a Sutaputra, a charioteer's son, what we would today call an OBC in today's affirmative action language. But he has enormous talent, enormous ambition, and he becomes, with great odds, he becomes the biggest fighter, the best fighter in the world, best warrior, and able to challenge, the only one who can challenge Arjuna. There is a version of the Mahabharata, which is an alternative rendering, where Karna falls in love with Draupadi. And so Draupadi's father has a swayamvara, and all the nobles and kings come, and it's a very difficult contest, where you have to strike at a moving target, lifting this heavy bow, and everybody fails except Karna. So he thinks he has won Draupadi. He goes to her, expecting to be garlanded and declared her husband. But she says, I won't marry a Sutaputra. And his face drops. And that unrequited sexual yearning for Draupadi continues as a subplot in the Mahabharata. However, Karna's story is only about the pain of being low caste in a caste society. because he is constantly being slighted. He wants the world to accept him as a Kshatriya, and constantly he's treated like an OBC. But it is also a more universal problem that we all suffer from. And that is the problem, that's why my chapter is called Karna's Status Anxiety. We all suffer, we all want to be somebody. We don't want to grow up and be nobody. When we are babies, there's no problem. We cry, we break our toys, we burp, our mothers love us. But when we grow up, we are judged. And people want to know what our status is. Is he important or not? In fact, I wrote my first book, it was successful, and suddenly some page 3 hostesses in Delhi started sending us dinner invitations. And my wife said, your next book better be successful, otherwise we'll stop getting these invitations. Status anxiety. And at the heart of it is somehow the unfortunate human condition that our self-esteem is held hostage to the opinion of others. And that's why my aunt's friend used to say that you wouldn't worry so much what others think of you if only you realize that they don't. Meaning that they are thinking what others are thinking of them, and those others are thinking what others are thinking of them, and nobody's thinking of you, and yet you're obsessed. What is she thinking of me? So this is an example of how the Mahabharat opens up a universe of thinking for us. And, before I leave Karna, there is that moment in the Mahabharat where it's very clear now the war is inevitable. The Pandavas go back. Duryodhana refuses to give back the kingdom. And suddenly, Krishna, who is the master strategist of the Pandavas, realizes these Pandavas are going to lose the war with Karna on the other side. So he goes to Karna to tell him who he is. And he says, you are not an OBC, you are a Kshatriya. You are not only a Kshatriya, you are a royal Kshatriya. Not only that, you are the eldest. So with you and Arjun on our side, if you switch sides, we're going to conquer the earth and we'll win the war. And you will be king. And Draupadi will be yours. Imagine everything he always wanted. But he refuses to switch sides. And listen to what he says. He says, your mother is not the one who gives birth to you, but the one who brings you up. Now, I would write down that sentence on every blackboard in NIIT University. In a caste society, that is the motto that we should have. The Mahabharata is a dark story. Everybody dies in the end. And the victors have to rule over an empty kingdom for 35 years. But in this darkness, I believe the Mahabharata snatches victory in moments like these, when Karna does not switch sides. And at the end of the epic, when Yudhishthira is going to heaven, some of you remember that a stray dog attaches itself to him. And together they walk, as the Mahabharata describes, looking straight, not looking at each other. And they reach heaven, and Indra, the heaven keeper, comes out and says, welcome, great king, we have waited for this moment. And Yudhishthira, instead of going in, says, but what about this dog? And Indra says, he's not even your dog, he's a dirty street dog. Besides, this is heaven, no dogs allowed. Yudhishthira wonders, what sort of a place is this which does not even understand the ABC of Dharma? That if somebody comes to you for refuge, you help them out. And of course he does not go in. Now I don't think anybody in this room would have done what Yudhishthira did. But every child in every culture will understand the meaning of Dharma from this story. And so the Mahabharat is saying that, it's a dark world, the Dharma is difficult to understand. Yudhishthira is still looking for Dharma at the end of the epic. But an act of goodness is one of the few things we possess as human beings. And let us learn to recognize it when we see it. Thank you.